I know everyone here knows a lot about this space, knows a lot about the sector, but I mean, this is a massive, massive problem for all of us. And I think when I talk to the Sway team and I talk to the Next Cube team and I talk to all of our friends and allies, I try to distill, what is it that really gets us up in the morning and how do we measure success for what we're doing every day and investing? And I really think when we look back 20 years from now, the question is, are we actually improving the lives of the people here and the loved ones and the friends that everyone has? Whether it's trying to help get a better drug or trying to improve a hospital system or trying to improve the delivery of care. Really, I think the measure for all of us as entrepreneurs and investors and as friends is when we look back 20 years from now, have we actually improved lives? So I think that's a big part of what we're going to talk about today. So briefly, and then I'll hand this over to Daniel. So Sway Ventures and Next Cube, I think fundamentally, what are we doing? We're investing in brilliant teams that are trying to change the world through software. Healthcare is probably one of our three biggest sectors that we're investing in. And we've been fortunate enough to invest in about 150 companies across the two organizations. We've had just shy of 15 exits. And I think for us, as we were to look at our 1-year plan, our 3 to 5 year plan, healthcare is probably one of the most important sectors to us. So thank you all for attending. I'll give it to Daniel to talk a little bit about our solution, and then we'll get into our panels.
Yeah. Thanks, Bill. Thanks, Bill. So Bill was outlining what many of us know to be the challenges in healthcare, and specifically in the U.S. healthcare market. What today is really about is to talk about how we're using software to solve those problems. So today we're going to have two panel discussions with investors, operators, senior folks to talk about how they're deploying software to solve the problems in the delivery of care in this country, which, as Bill was mentioning, too many people are receiving too little care, and then many people are receiving too little care, and then a very small fraction of this country is receiving way too much care. And so Bill's panel with the panelists there are going to cover how we're changing that dynamic, stratifying patient populations, right? Using software to intelligently guide the delivery of care. And then I'm going to be moderating a panel where we're talking about the future of pharma, right? How we're using artificial intelligence to transform drug discovery from something that takes $2 billion in 10 to 20 years to something that can happen on a computer literally in the matter of hours. How changing how clinical trials are designed, how they're implemented, how data's collected, and even post-approval with real-world evidence, how we're changing the way that we interact with drugs and we know which drugs are working for which people. Right? And what you're going to see here today are the folks that are leading this charge. And many of you guys here in this room are also part of that. And that's what we really wanted to do today. We wanted to bring together a group of corporate venture capitalists, tier one founders and entrepreneurs, together with senior operators, BD folks, C-level executives, and pharma and strategic healthcare organizations to have a frank discussion about where we've been, where we're going, and how software can really drive this future that we're all looking at, right? And we really don't have a choice. This is the way things have to go because things are unsustainable. And I think we'll hear a lot about that today. Now, we also want to have a lot of interaction with the audience. We've curated this crowd specifically because these are folks that we want to have in the room and we want to have a discussion. So hopefully we have a lot of time for Q&A. Before I turn it back over to Bill and our first panel, though, I want to say thank you to a lot of our sponsors for this event that you guys may have seen previously, including Cressa, Kenobi Martins, Aptar, the Alliance for AI and Healthcare, and also Boehringer Ingelheim Ventures, who have helped us put on this event. So we're really excited to have this. Obviously, this is one of our homes together with San Diego that are really focused on healthcare, and we really are happy to have all of you guys here in the audience. So with that, I think, Bill, I'll turn it back over to you and to the first panel.
We're going to talk a little bit about the future of delivery, and by way of introduction, I'm one of the partners at Sway. I'm a board member at NextCubed. And for us, it's really exciting, as I said earlier, just to be a part of the future of healthcare. So Iana and I have had a chance to get to know each other over the last couple of months. She is a director of investing at GE Ventures. And I think what I love about Iana's background is, she's an investor, but also comes from a technical background at Alvarez and Marsal. She and I will talk a lot about the infrastructure and kind of the nuts and bolts, the unsexy stuff within healthcare. And Sai, I was talking to Daniel about how do we describe your job at Aptar? It's like he's trying to make what Aptar does cool, new, and innovative, right? That's a good way to put it. But yeah, if both of you would just give a little bit about your background, I think it's helpful because it frames the discussion that we'll have today. So Iana, if you wouldn't mind going first.
Great, and thank you very much for having me. I'm really happy to be here and have met already some really great founders, and thank you for Sway for hosting such a great event. Yes, so I started my career actually as an entrepreneur focused on building these facilities that provide an advanced form of radiation therapy for cancer patients. We raised $750 million, which at that point was a lot of money. Nowadays, I feel like we just would have been another term sheet, blurb mentioning yet another company that does that. And really focused on providing the best type of care that you could in the U.S. due to this advanced form of treatment that's been developed in the 50s. We actually took care of a lot of patients who came to us from Europe, the Middle East, and other places that just didn't have access. And so after that, I actually moved to Alvarez & Marsal, which is primarily a restructuring firm. It has a really significant private equity practice. So there I spent time with KKR and Warburg Pincus, who are large customers, really helping with their portfolio operations and also helping invest. And what I realized was that I was really doing companies that were 100 million revenue plus, and I missed being early. But I really liked the investing side. So I decided to change and come over to GE Ventures, where for the last 4.5 years, I've really spent my time focused on digital health. And it's really any solution that targets providers, pharma, and payers, deeply focused on analytics and also the proliferation of how do you implement new technologies and things like genetics and the actual care delivery models.
Nothing like that, but okay. My name is Sai Shankar. I work for Aptar Pharma, and most of you probably do not know Aptar, and that's quite okay. We like it that way. Every US household has probably got 12 Aptar products, and that's the way we like it. Aptar has been around for 70 years and really focused on drug delivery. So nasal spray, inhalation technology, dermal, drug delivery, ophthalmology, really in all those areas. So chances are you probably use our products one time or the other. I was brought in from Pharma, so I've spent 15 years in Pharma at Sanofi and then with Allergan. And when I was brought in, the focus was really to build out a digital portfolio for the company and really define the strategy for the business. So while we are in the drug delivery space, we really don't have a portfolio on the digital side. And as you look at most devices and how it's being worked in the market, there is a strategic shift towards data, digital platforms. And I strongly believe that that should not be where we should stop. We should really go to the last mile care delivery. So what we've been doing is over the last 18 to 24 months is really focus on integrating systems and technologies where we have device platforms, integrate with data and data analytics and data services, and then taking it one step further and partnering with care management companies and looking at delivery modules and seeing how we can actually bring it to the end patient. And I say last mile care delivery because that's where you will start making a huge difference. People call it remote patient monitoring or telemedicine, et cetera. But it's going to start with someone prescribing it the first time around. So with that in mind, we actually really came to forefront when we invested in Propeller Health. Some of you might know them. We actually were leading the round for them before they exited. And they exited well, so good for them and good for us. But the idea was to create those kinds of partnerships. So we've been really focusing on building a portfolio, but also investing in a lot of these startups and platform companies where we believe we can bring that kind of last mile care delivery.
Good. Sai, just while you're talking, I think talk to me a little bit about just your general view of the future of the delivery of care. Like, what does that actually look like? And I think it's for Aptar, but just in general, as you look at a macro environment, kind of the next 5 to 10 years.
I think everybody would agree that the current models that we have in place are archaic and they're not really going to move forward. So when you look at the amount of time a doctor is spending with a patient to really understand their disease state and then looking at comorbidities that come along with it, it's really not there. And as technology evolves and there's more data out there, I strongly believe that care model is going to change a lot more. So when you have specialties, when the doctor is going to do surgeries or really look at oncology patients, et cetera, I think that's where the specialties will really exist. But everything else in the general medicine side, I think it's going to become more automated, digitized. You're going to really have technology deployed across the spectrum. Your smartphone is going to become your companion tool. And if it's not already, it will. I strongly believe in that. And as that happens, and I'm not saying it's because I'm in the tech space, you just see the evolution of it. My dad's 82. And he uses a smartphone more than me, and I really wonder why, but he does. And he's looking at ways to improve he's looking at reminders to set for medication, et cetera, manually, and I told him some apps. So this is going to happen. And as that proliferates, I believe RPM becomes huge. So really, it'll be data-driven at the end of the day. So tech companies could be partially the health companies of the future, in my opinion.
Yeah. And then, Iana, I think it was maybe a month ago before we get into the holidays, you and I were talking about really the future of healthcare, but I think we can apply it to the delivery of care. And a part of our conversation was, look, the big innovations are going to happen behind the scenes, and it's not really sexy, but it's still really a fundamental problem. So maybe talk to me about some of your experiences and maybe even relate it to some of the investments that you've done.
Absolutely. So I think that when I first came to GE, I was going to find an interoperability company that I was going to invest in because it's the holy grail that everyone chases. And what encouraged me to go on that wild chase was that when I was advising a health system that was about to go through a pretty significant integration, it was a pretty small hospital within the health system. And they had 30 or 40 beds, and they had decided, because of meaningful use, to buy Epic. So that right there is so I walked in and I could not, they give you the financial statements and I couldn't figure out why they could have a couple hundred employees and then they had 600 consultants. And what are they doing? And they said, oh, they're scribes. I said, okay, well, how much are you getting from meaningful use to implement Epic? And it's like, $1 million. And so how much are you spending on the scribes? It's like $7 million. And he said, okay. So, right there, the math is not making sense. And then what happened was, because I was in charge of sort of the integration work, again, purely from the financial and operational perspective, I got a call in the middle of the night at 3 a.m., and somehow I ended up on kind of the emergency response telemetry for the health system. And what had happened was that the generator had gone out and the backup generator in the hospital had gone out. And because they were in the transition away from paper records to Epic, there was no back-end system for medication management. So suddenly what you have are patients in the ICU and you have no idea what drugs they're supposed to be given because nobody was keeping a backup system. And so I remember being told that you have to go there. I was like, what am I going to do? I'm going to take my financial calculator. And so I think once you've seen that, you realize that as much as meaningful use was supposed to really create a phenomenal way of integrating patient care across the U.S., it just has not worked very well. And so it's up to technology companies to now fix this issue. And, without picking too much onto Epic or Cerner or others, what we've really seen is I think that some of the innovation is going to come in the ability to either use APIs or for really sort of large device companies and other technology companies to really demand that some of these EHRs actually integrate better and be able to deliver access to patient care. And I do think that the interesting thing where you're starting to see that happen is that there are definitely startups that are really working on increasing, but it's still really hard just because it's so foreign to the system. So I always say that if you can solve anything, honestly, the things I would start at are, fix billing, right? I mean, I don't know if you've ever been to a health system department. There are rooms with hundreds of people just doing manual billing, right? So they look at the EHR and then they have the billing system and they're entering data by hand, and 30% of the time they'll make a mistake, and that results in denials and it increases costs, and that's terrible for patient care, and it drives up costs, and it really prevents physicians from actually being able to do their job. So I think the solutions that are really focused on those layers are things that I'm particularly excited about investing in, and I think longer term they'll have the impact of hopefully making some of those horrible statistics that you quoted just a bit better, a little bit better.
Right, we got to chip away at it. Yeah, and it is interesting. I'm sure everyone here in the audience, independent of what you're doing, investing or building, it always comes up in conversations. Data, systems, and I tend to love that. Right, if I find something that's either in Excel or ends up in a piece of paper, I'm like, all right, there's a business to be built here. So it's exciting, and it sounds like you've seen the same thing. And Sai, we were talking about this kind of early on. I mentioned we were going to talk about the problems, but I think also kind of talk about some of the solutions. We talked about this disconnect between the people that really need the care, right, and then the delivery of that care. So in your mind, what are some of the solutions that you've seen, and or what are some of the solutions that you think could be as we look into the future?
The 550 model is known, right? 5% of the population is taking 50% of all the healthcare spend, and it's ridiculous. We actually have a board member who's the CEO of a hospital chain, and there's a pediatric population, which is from an economically backward community. The challenge is that the kids are coming back to the ER each and every single time, and the parents are not doing anything about it. Now, can we automate the process where we can have interventions built in, where if the parents are not doing what they're supposed to do, there's somebody else who can help them, a nurse practitioner. We were talking to a hospital system where they had 80% readmission rates because the patients were not taking their medication, and you have a challenge now where the insurance is not covering them anymore because they're saying your readmission is too high. So now they have to put in place a manual system. We've got nurse practitioners, instead of doing what your hope is better than reminding people, is to literally call the patients and ensure they're doing what they're supposed to do to ensure the readmission rate is going down. Now, to be fair to them, they've reduced it by 90%, which means it's highly effective, which means it's doable. Now, it's done at a very high cost of human capital, but it's doable. And now if we find a way with digital health, with the solutions that we already have out there to automate that process, and even if we get to 70% reduction, but maybe 70% reduction also in the resources spent, you've got a very healthy balance both from financial standpoint and scalability, because you cannot have 100 nurses keep calling and try and scale that. But I can have a digital solution put in, I can scale it to millions of patients. And I think that's where the magic sauce is from my perspective. So there are multiple opportunities of this kind we look at. We also look at cost. Everybody's talking about outcomes-based reimbursement. Pharma, for the first time in years, it's like car. If you don't like it, return it in so many days and we'll reimburse you. Pharma did that. Nobody thought that's going to happen because they all realized at the end of the day, if you cannot show outcomes, you're done. But now, how does pharma show improvement in outcomes if they're not adherent? And how do you measure adherence if you don't have something to monitor them remotely? So again, you can keep extending the logic, and that's where you are. So that's the area that we believe. That's why I focus on the last mile care delivery. If you can address that, and then the back end, we take all the systems and fix that, that's your magic right there.
Yeah, there we go. It's those little incremental,
simple, right?
Incremental changes. Well, I think we might have a microphone handy. I'd love to engage some of the audiences. Anyone has any questions or comments? There we go. There we go, Patrick. Yeah, go for it.
This has to do with behemoths like GE, ABB, Honeywell, Emerson, and you have BU presidents and so on leading these businesses. Yeah, and getting this through that juggernaut is difficult. I'm just curious on the GE side, how have you been successful doing that? And if you're a young founder in the audience thinking, "Gosh, I'm going to break into GE," not so fast. You're going to go here, here, here. So just maybe give the teams a bit of a sense of that.
And is the question, how do you navigate, if you're a founder and entrepreneur, how do you navigate working with larger organizations?
I think it's both that, Bill, and I think it's also from an M&A perspective / investor perspective for a large corporate. How do you get that done? So it's both.
Yes. So I think that the reason why GE was created, or GE Ventures was created, was because Jeff and Mel realized that it was very difficult for a company who had quarterly goals that had $120 billion of revenue to really be focused on innovation that wouldn't really become relevant from a P&L perspective for 7 or 10 years. But as everybody knows, and as everybody has seen, especially in the last couple of years, conglomerates that don't pay attention to small companies don't do very well at the end. And so I think he was very afraid that that would happen to GE over time. But what was really important to him was that GE Ventures would be really dedicated on driving financial returns, which you could only do if you're truly backing innovation that was sustainable at the large scale, while also providing strategic value. So what you would also see at our investment committee meetings was that we definitively had the G representative from the relevant business unit there. And a lot of the times they argued that the things that we were perhaps interested in investing were not strategic, right? So digital innovation, whether it was going to touch the imaging space or whether it was in the bioprocessing space, which is still relatively new, it was just too far in advance. These companies were too small. And what would inevitably happen 3 or 4 years later is that the investments that we made, which we were told were not strategic, end up being the most strategic things. Every single time I started keeping track so that I can go into the investment committee and, but I think that what you also saw was that our business unit leaders realized that. And I think over time with that experience, with having an internal arm, they did see that there was change that was happening. The other thing that was occurring concurrently with that was that we were making introductions with some of the companies that we had invested into with some of the G business units. What we always said was, you should not partner with us because you believe that you will be able to derive revenue directly from G as a customer. That's very difficult to do. You have to reach a certain scale. But the times that we were successful, it works incredibly well, because if you're able to tap into, again, whether it's imaging or it's diagnostics, and you're able to get a champion who really believes in the solution, then the power of GE is that you can deploy quickly and you can solicit customer feedback at a much faster rate than if you were to go health system by health system by health system. So what I'll say is that we're still young, and a lot of the companies were still very much in kind of the couple $1 million in revenue. But I think the partnerships for strategics, if you have the right champions, could do wonders for the company. I just always warn that it has to be at a time frame that makes sense for you. So don't take on G as a customer unless you can actually handle G as a customer.
So your point is, as a founder pitching to a large corporation, you need to make a point that it is not strategic to their business, and then that'll get you in the door.
It's amazing. It's amazing what will happen. Yeah.
Alex, I think you had a question, or were you just stretching your arm? No, there you go.
Can I give a perspective on this? I believe, so G is a behemoth, let's be honest. So it's too big. But there are other, I would say, mid-sized to smaller-sized companies out there, corporates, publicly traded, who have a very different approach to it. At Aptar, we don't have a formal venture arm, but the management team realized that we need to be participate in these economies, and we really have gone all out, and you know about it. But the idea really is engage, even if there's two men and we call it 2 men and a molecule, because they're developing drug products and we want to be participating in the economy. But similarly, there are ideas out there that we don't want to just discount, but what we take a view of being a strategic, and we don't want to be a pure VC. We want to take an approach where we are actually going to be strategic to this business. And if it makes sense, it doesn't matter if it's a small or a large opportunity, as long as it's accretive and whether it's at a core level or adjacent level to the business. So that is something we would definitely participate in. And I would say there are quite a few companies in our space that we play in who take a very similar approach. And I think depending on what your solution is and what you're trying to really do, there are opportunities for those kinds of companies. So just depends. So I think it's important to know your audience and who you're really going after and understand the business model.
All right, next question.
Yeah, so this is certainly an exciting discussion we're having here today, and we definitely need software and technology to help in this area. Although it seems that more than having technology really try to triage some of the situation we're in, we need to build a bridge to wellness that incorporates consumers, genomics, all these different technologies. I'd love to hear your thoughts on how you see that bridge or the pillars of that bridge, where they need to be established, where the big bets are, because ultimately it's those of us in the room, we're the ones that make that possible. And it'd be great to hear your thoughts on that.
And is your question specific around the bridge to wellness? Like how do you take this complex mass and chip away at it?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot there,
Yeah.
and we can throw technology at paper problems. We can throw technology at human capital inefficiency. But more than that, we really need to get to a world where technology facilitates our everyday well-being.
Yeah.
But it's not just one app that's going to solve that. It's a whole ecosystem. It's an infrastructure. It's software. It's technology. It's collaboration. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
I'm going to buy time so they can think about that, because that's a really hard question. It's like, how do you solve that? So I'll meander for a second while they think about that. It is interesting, right? Because healthcare, like, enterprise SaaS businesses, which I've done very well in as an investor, it kind of becomes simple, right? Like, okay, you kind of figure out your target customer and you have your business model, and it's a very simplistic model when compared to healthcare. If you look at just very basic components, you have the patients, you have the hospital systems, you have the medical device companies, you have the drug makers, and all the intricacies in there. So I think part of the problem that we're all dealing with is it is such a complex system. To get to answer your question on how do you improve general wellness or how do you improve lives, there isn't one answer. So I have a piece, but now that I bought you time, we'll go down the line.
Thank you. That was very well done. I really like that. I have to remember that for future panels. I think there's a recent study that came out that showed that projections are that by 2030, half of the U.S. population will be obese. And so I think when we talk about wellness, what's a bit frustrating is that, especially I'm a New Yorker, I've now been living in San Francisco for 3 years, we think about the coast, right? So many of the solutions that I saw as an investor in the wellness space, the applicable markets are healthy people who work out 3 to 4 times a week,
Everyone who
eat
doesn't
kale, and are on multiple diets, et cetera. And that is a market, and there's some companies that have done very well that are purely consumer focused. That to me does not work truly in terms of kind of clinical grade healthcare products. And so where I go back to when I think about wellness is actually that it's been widely published that the majority of your healthcare status is not determined by where you receive care. It is by things like housing and whether you have access to food that is appropriate. It's where it's your psychological well-being. So in the past couple of years, social determinants of health, which is this grouping, have finally, I think, gotten there in the sun. And so when I actually think about wellness, I think about how do you make those pieces be integrated within clinical care. So if somebody has to go into the health system just because their glucose levels are increasing and they're diabetic, how do you actually screen for the fact that what they really need is access to the right food clinic so that you can get them a referral. And by the way, you have to get them a referral and make sure that the clinic is open between the hours and then it's still in the same location and that hasn't changed. And then how do you ensure that they have a landlord who is able to extend their rent, and how do you get them clothing if it's a cold climate? So to me, that's the really exciting part. What I'll say is that it is a purely services-oriented business. There are technologies that can help with screens, with connections, with closing the loop, but you have to have the services layer. And so I think the struggle there is that that's not being well taken care of. And to be honest, reimbursement models so far have not accommodated for that. So there's no incentive to actually go ahead and help patients with that because it's not part of the referrals. So I think that's where I'd go and what I'm excited about.
Honestly, we never solved the problem here. But I'll give an example, and I might be misquoting here, but somebody can correct me. There was an experiment done probably in one of the Nordic countries where a population was not doing well. They gave them like $1,000 stipend, etc. And suddenly they not only were having a better lifestyle, their quality of life improved, their health numbers improved. And that was directly related to stress. Because when they didn't have to think about the fact that they didn't have to worry about where my next meal is coming from or where my next rent, it changed their health numbers. And I don't know exactly which country it is, I don't want to state, but that happened. So the point is, Finland, there you go. Okay, thank you. So this is not going to be driven by pharma. It's not going to be driven by a health system, a standalone. If you look at pharma companies, they want to be health and wellness companies now. I mean, if you look at the trend lines, that's where they're going. They want to be health and wellness and services companies. They want to get one step closer to the patients, which they are not allowed to, but they're trying to. If you look at payers don't want to pay anymore. If you go and talk to any of the payers, they'll say, we really want to be in the human services business. I mean, it's true. That's what they're really going after. So it will change, but to your point, the innovation is happening on the coasts. Nobody's going. I come from Midwest. I spent time in Kansas City. Who's from Kansas City? Yeah, hey, one guy, Chiefs. I mean, you really have to go to the Midwest and see how things are out there. So the thing is, technology is letting people broadcast ideas, but the ideas are very topical to a given area. So technology will only take you so far, but there are other systems. So social determinants of health, it's such a big buzzword now. Everybody's throwing, like 3 years back it was blockchain and then AI and this, now is this. Every year you're going to get that, but I don't think you're not going to have any one single idea that's really going to take off, honestly.
It sounds like the common theme here is it really is still a lot of blocking and tackling kind of in the weeds. And I'll give one specific area as well. I mean, I think there are technologies that exist today around early diagnosis for horrible diseases that not even the coasts are taking advantage of, much less the rest of the U.S. So I think as we think about just early diagnosis, I think it's not even, we don't even have to make major innovations, which I think can come. Like in this calendar year, we can start to take better advantage, and really it comes to education for early diagnosis. So that's one of the things that I'm personally excited about. Probably one more question, and then I'll kind of, you got the mic, so let's go.
I was going to say, I went ahead and grabbed it. So when you talk about wellness and general health, 80% of the healthcare spend is driven by patient behavior and social determinants of health. But if you invert that, look at the other end, and you look at rare diseases, defined as incidence of 40 per 100,000. So individually quite rare, but since there are 6,300 of them, 30 million Americans, 35 million Europeans have a rare disease. These are by far the most expensive patients. They cost 5x what a non-rare disease patient costs. And a third of the drugs in phase 2 and phase 3 development today have orphan indications. But these, unlike the sort of have a nurse practitioner make sure they're taking their meds, 80% of these diseases have a genomic etiology. So the early diagnosis, average diagnosis for a rare disease patient takes 7.6 years. Over half the patients with a rare disease don't know they have it. It's a completely different class of problem with very, very high return per individual patient, but much smaller populations of patients to be managed. As investors and participants in the ecosystem, what's your view on going after that particular population?
I'm going to stall even more than I did from the last question. That's a hard. No, look, I think just trying to kind of put that back to the audience. Rare diseases, it's an economic problem, right? Where when you look at it from an investor standpoint, which we've done in the last 6 months, we've looked very specifically at this space. It's how do you take things that are truly damning from that lifestyle standpoint, like we talked about, how do we improve lives, but you can't make the economics pencil from an investor standpoint, from a company standpoint. So I think it's like, how do you start to tackle that just from a macro standpoint? So.
Well, also Simon is CEO of a rare disease company, so it's
I may be
bit
a
of
little
a
biased.
complicated question. Somebody, I was at a meeting the other day, and there's a question posed about rare disease, especially because some of the drugs are coming to market, and there's this constant thought on the pharma side, which is, how do we continue to develop therapeutics that are really serving this population. And if they take too long, how do we keep justifying the economic cost associated with it, right? Especially if there are large failures, and especially if we're not doing it better than all the other drugs, but the markets are just smaller. And at some point, you just can't once you diagnose a patient after 7.6 years, you can't then say it's a $3 million a year treatment. Some have tried. We'll see how that goes. But somebody said to me the other day, look, maybe what we have to get better at diagnosis, but maybe what we also have to do is that as we start to better understand, especially through genomics, some of these patients at an earlier status in terms of their when they first present, is that we have to develop more centers of excellence where these patients are hard to treat. They're not necessarily something that the health system wants to take on. So there are clinical guidelines that are developed for some of them. And if a physician sees it, that the referral happens more immediately to a center of excellence. And if you build these throughout the country, then you can get reimbursements and pharma to actually align as to how to get patients there. And I think that's actually a much more clever of a solution than I would have thought. Because if you talk to physicians, they don't really understand those patients. They don't want to treat them. They're scared that they will do something wrong. They don't like saying, I don't know what's wrong with you, right? I've performed 11 tests and nothing is conclusive. And so I think that that's what I'm excited about. And I think there's actually a path, because that's the physician sentiment, because they're not trying to keep the patients captive, to actually get them to hopefully better care faster, so that they can receive kind of the treatment they need and at least get on that treatment pathway.
I have a but I have a view on this. Pharma rushed in because there's an opportunity to make a lot of money, and the pathway was faster. Let's be honest. I mean, it's an opportunity. They were doing it's a good cause, but that's where the opportunity lies. There are companies that are now doing a lot of work from the AI standpoint. Daniel, you're going to talk about that, where they're going to accelerate some of the work being done, so the time to market as well as the cost associated with it will hopefully come down. But the one thing I really saw, which was quite incredible, was where patient advocacy groups fought for approvals. And I'm not going to name the companies. If you look at the history of the last couple of years, you will see that. So when you talk about center of excellence, when you talk about patient advocacy groups for these very rare diseases, and these are tiny populations, but they are very powerful in their voicing of what they really need. I think that's where the combo of the two will have to come together to make a change. And then we'll overlay technology then with the pharmas or I would say 2-minute molecule, I shouldn't say that, but small startups who are really pushing the packet on it, and the genomics coming to play. I think there's room to improve change, both the financial models that come along and the time to get there. But I'm giving very nebulous answers here, unfortunately, but I really believe that's kind of how it's happening. And probably the direction, I would say, we're not there yet. Probably in the next 7 years or 8 years, you're probably going to see a drastic shift on how we're able to approach these patient populations and address the market. Because I think the risk-taking is going up. I would have never thought the agency would have ever approved, but they did. And the patients not complaining, they're quite happy about it, because for a very small targeted population, it's bringing value. And they are happy about it, irrespective of the profile and the risk associated with it. And that's where it's going to change. The risk-taking is going to change.
Well, I thank you both for some great insights, and I think just some closing comments, and then Daniel, I'll hand it over to you to go to the next panel. I think as we think about this problem and kind of the delivery of care, one of the things I think we're really excited about that I think can have a dramatic impact, as we talked about in kind of the end consumers' lives in 2020, there still are horrible diseases that are impacting people in this audience and everyone that we know. And I really do fundamentally believe that we can make dramatic changes in the next 12 months. One is on the early diagnosis side, the other is on the treatment side. And I think we can create economic value in the companies that we're all building. The biggest drivers, I still think, really are going to be in the delivery of the cures, right? And how do we start to facilitate that? Whether it's the processes, the systems, the actual drugs themselves, speeding up clinical trials, whatever it may be. So I think that's something that we're all really passionate about, and I'd kind of like to thank the panelists and the audience all with great questions. So thank you all.
where the first panel was about the delivery of care, as I mentioned before, we're going to talk about what we really see as the future of pharma here. And we've got two founders here that are utilizing AI to drive part of that future. We have a physician by training in David that he'll tell you a little bit about what he does, but who's an investor in this space and at really the bleeding edge of where technology is going. But to sort of, to set the stage here, we all are constantly bombarded about stories about pharma that are in the news today, and most of them, frankly, are not very good. Pharma is being pounded constantly, especially around concepts around pricing, right? And people feeling like they're being gouged for pharmaceutical treatments. You have pharma executives on the other side that push back and they say, look, the reality of this industry is that it takes 10, sometimes 20 years to bring a new therapy to market. And we're spending $2 billion, if not more, in sunk capital to bring these drugs to market. And we only 1 out of 10 drugs that reach the clinic ever make it to market to begin with, let alone the thousands of failures that occur in the preclinical setting. And pharma will tell you as well, they said, look, we're chasing down the hardest diseases today. All the low-hanging fruit that's been picked. And so now we're going after these rare diseases and we're changing people's lives, right? Fundamentally extending their lives, improving the years they have that are quality years. And they say, well, the cost of these products are the cost that it takes to bring these things to market. But I think the folks that are up here on the panel today, though, are going to describe to you a little bit about what they're doing or what they're investing in and how that might not be the case. Although it's the reality today, the future of pharma, I think, is extremely bright. And I think there's a process here, whether it's the companies that David's investing in or the things that Kim and George are building, that can truly transform the way that pharma is developed and delivered to patients. So without further ado, I'd first like to have all of our panelists introduce themselves and briefly give some background on yourself and a little bit of overview of what you're doing, but we'll come back around too for a deeper dive. George, I'll start with you.
Yeah, thanks. My name is George Nicola. So I echo all of these sentiments, and it's actually really well positioned that we're having this talk directly after the last one. It almost teed us up because it is a bigger issue. It's healthcare is a problem. There's lots of issues with it, but if you think of pharmaceuticals and where we fit in, it's a small piece of that pie is the drug process, but even that is massively inefficient, and there's a lot of help that can go into that. So despite of all the healthcare costs and pharmaceuticals being just one of that, I think there's so much room for advancement, so much room for technology in it. So my background, I've been at the intersection of computer science and the biomedical sciences for about 25 years now. This started out when I was literally told, the computer science departments and the natural science departments are completely different disciplines, different sides of campus. There's nothing that you're going to find that has an intersection between those two. To last night when I was told by someone at a networking event that, I've heard 10 stories about someone doing data science in the healthcare already tonight. So it's nice to see that, that the transition and the evolution of the merging of these fields and seeing what people have done and being at the forefront of that. So I've been primarily an academic for maybe too long, but I kept getting put onto projects that were really interesting, and I was learning and I was finding new ways of applying what I had known to the drug discovery, molecular modeling, and then into finding new uses for existing drugs. So I can go into how Repurpose kind of came to be, unless you want to kind of go back to around.
Give a little overview about Repurpose, then we'll come into some of the details of the technology.
Right. So most of what's done in academia when it comes to drug discovery is finding new molecules, and this is what everyone is really thinking about: is how can we discover the holy grail, the shiny new molecule that's going to be a high potent binder to a cancer protein or to a protein involved in a heart disease, or some other type of pathway. And I think what gets lost in the frenzy of understanding more about the biology and the chemistry and the biophysics and the biochemical interactions of the pathways and the systems biology and the genomics that is really incredible, especially at the top tier academic institutions, is that there's a huge elephant in the room and a barrier to getting that shiny, amazing molecule into a patient, and that is the FDA. Yep. And so when I finally took the exit ramp out of academia and got into business, I started to appreciate that. And I started to appreciate not only the regulatory barriers to drug discovery and development, but the business barriers. And so I've been primarily interested in how to not only come up with a molecule that would be interesting and effective in a particular disease, but how to get there quicker. And where most companies and biopharma and chemical labs start with a target, and you think of a disease and a progression of multiple proteins banging into each other and causing what should be the appropriate path, but ends up being a disease path. They try to ameliorate that with a drug. And at its core, and this is maybe just a side distraction of the technical aspect of it, a small molecule, a drug, is really just maybe 10, 20, 100 atoms. I mean, these are really, really tiny molecules. And as such, they jam up the machinery. And they do so in the case of rational drug design, to block a disease pathway. For instance, a cancer protein is not doing its job. Let's jam it with a small molecule. So how do we create, the other metaphor is a bullet and a target, or a key and a lock. How do we create a better key for that particular lock? And so most of the industry historically has been taking the lock of interest, the cancer protein that we're trying to target, and creating better and better molecules for it. But as I was mentioning, the big barrier that people don't realize is that no matter how great your molecule is, you still have to take it through the steps of testing for safety, of getting into animals, of doing all the preclinical, and then eventually the phase 1 clinical trials. So what we've done with this platform that I built is basically flip the script. And rather than starting with a target of known relevance, I start with a drug that has already gone through the gamut of safety tests. Literally starting with a drug that made it past phase 1 and is for some reason failing in phase 2 or has recently failed. And that's the starting point for the platform. So the computational approach, it's an AI-based approach that I built that's trained on a large data set of known interactors of small molecules and their protein targets. And it finds activity based on the premise of chemical mimicry, but rather than taking direct descriptor-based deterministic approaches to the similarity, I use AI to fish out those features that are most discriminatory between binders and non-binders. So it's a classification problem at its core, but the trick is getting that data, cleaning it, making it machine readable, and then using it for the training of this model. And ultimately, it'll predict, rather than a new molecule to a target for the molecule. Now we have a molecule that's phase 2 ready at the get-go. So now it's just finding the path, and many times we can accelerate that path even further by going for the rare disease, by going for a high unmet need, by going for something that the FDA is literally clamoring to make it easy for us to do. So that's the premise of Repurpose AI, and I'll get into it even deeper if you want.
Yeah, but no, I appreciate that. And Kim, your technology, your company really picks up where George and Repurpose leave off. So love for you to talk to a little bit about Trials AI and clinical trial innovation.
Sure.
What you guys are up to.
So my background, this is my third company. My first company I started was consulting big pharma. And loved it, did it for 12 years. And then my best friend got diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, went into the doctor with a stomach ache and came out with 5 months to live. And so frankly, he gave me a call and said, look, there's no treatment. Is there any way you can get me into a clinical trial? You've been in the space, you've got friends. And at that point, after the shock kind of started to wear off, started reaching out to friends in the industry, and heard over and over there are a couple of promising treatments on the bench, but by the time we get them clinical trial ready, he'll be gone. And so, true to that, about 8 months later, he passed away. And in that process, I really started to ask questions around why. Why is it taking so long? What does that mean? And what are we doing now that we can improve upon? And over and over, it kept coming back to us that there was a real need in the market to improve the clinical trials ecosystem. And the way that we look at it is kind of twofold. There's this, we break up the clinical trial value chain in terms of trial planning, and then trial execution. And there's been a lot of work done on the trial execution side. So, a lot of interesting startups as well as big guys like Oracle have been playing in that space for quite some time. And yet on the trial planning side, what we've seen is a lot of Microsoft Word and consulting. And, we think that's insane because there are so many amazing technologies that are being applied in other verticals that are pretty similar. And yet this has been kind of a dormant space and really greenfield. And so we saw an opportunity and of course took that. So really what our focus is to improve clinical trial planning by way of optimizing clinical trial protocols. And so really leveraging artificial intelligence to provide research teams with tools to provide insights and recommendations on how to construct their protocols. And, it's interesting. A lot of folks are like, okay, well, clinical trial protocols, that's not a very sexy space. And while it may not be, it is really exciting to us because it's, for those of you that are maybe football guys out there, it's really the playbook on how you're going to run your clinical trial. And often, you'll see statistics around trial failures, and people think of trial failures in terms of lack of efficacy of a particular treatment. But unfortunately, almost half of trials are failing because of poorly designed protocols in clinical trials. And really, that's the problem we're solving for.
Thanks, Kim. And David, David comes at this from a whole nother perspective as a former practicing physician, as an entrepreneur in the space, and now as an investor. And so, David, if you could speak a little bit about your background and what you're doing now, some of your investments, and what you're really interested in the space.
Thank you. So as Daniel mentioned, I'm actually a reformed physician, and to a point where there's a number of people who actually get a degree and go straight into business, but I went through the path of delayed gratification and got an MD, did a residency, and actually practiced medicine before jumping into the business world. So it's interesting because many of the technologies and solutions that I get exposed to, I do have the ability to actually see it from a clinical point of view, and that's somewhat helpful. I've been in the industry, now since 2000, but doing venture since 2003. Initially doing a lot of medtech investing, and then transforming into medtech plus some services and therapeutics. Around 2010, 2011, it was pretty clear this area that we used to call healthcare IT was really being now transforming into now what we call digital health. Enough so that I got interested and jumped to an operational role at a small startup. And I was mentioning earlier to Dan, it was literally 5 guys sitting around the table, no one getting paid. And 4 years later, we were at 45 people with having investors such as Intel Capital and Khosla and Sandbox supporting the company, and at 45 people. And at that point, it was pretty clear that digital health was just an area that a lot of people were excited about. I was working at a company that was doing data analytics with payers as customers. And really, you learned a lot about what it takes to actually commercialize. And, we're going to talk more about the pharma side, but I will take it from the perspective of, is pharma as a customer of many of the technologies that people are trying to, develop. But about 3.5 years ago, I was actually recruited to an opportunity where it was Astellas, it's another pharmaceutical company. Like many other big pharma, they were really interested in digital health, and they had really no idea what digital health was all about, but they wanted to learn more. And I think it's partly, pharma is very conservative, and you probably know that, but they don't want to be left behind. So they wanted to get to learn this area. So they were convinced that, hey, you should invest in this area and you will learn a ton. And in a way, it's true, right? When you go through the exercise of evaluating investment opportunity, you get to know not only the company, but the competitive landscape, the commercialization, pathway, and a lot of other things. So 3.5 years ago, we started Digitex Partners. Initially, a small pool of capital. Eventually, we made 7 investment out of that. But then about a little over a year ago, we closed on a second fund. So we now manage about $100 million overall of capital to deploy strictly in the digital health space. And you may ask, digital health is actually pretty broad. So how do you narrow it down to something that is investable? And for us is we look for opportunities in which that you're doing something really interesting with data. We find that in digital health, there isn't a lot of ways to create, let's say, a competitive and definitely an IP hurdle or pick a fence around you, so that we think that your use of data, your acquisition of data, and creating analytics from the data can actually distinguish yourself versus your competitors. And if you look at our portfolio, which is around 10 portfolio companies right now, is that they're all doing something really interesting with data, but ultimately to solve a problem. And this idea of, if you build it, people come. We really believe that you should find a problem that you understand, what the problem is and how to solve it and how to do it most efficiently versus anyone else. And we start from there, and we find that often it's not the technology that wins, it's actually your understanding of how to best solve the problem that wins. And so we focus on companies like that. We focus on Series A stage companies. We do look at seed stage companies, but we often find that they need to get through certain hurdles before we get really interested, because we want to really help them to grow. And we'll do somewhere around 5 deals a year. So, and I know that I've spoken with many of you guys about potential evaluation and stuff. So, but I look forward to having a conversation about pharma, partly because Astellas is our obviously LP, but I've had conversations with many of the pharma that's out here, and what I realize is that people are approaching digital health in a lot of different ways. That they don't have one strategy to say this is what we're going to do with digital health. It could run the gamut from we want to augment our existing franchise and do better clinical trials, all the way to we want to create separate businesses that can be part of our overall business. Or an opportunity to not just sell drug to an individual, but manage that person's disease. And so, it's hard to say that there is just one playbook for this whole pharma area, but I think we're going to be able to tease that out.
Yeah, thanks you, David. And as you can see, listening to the panel up here, in many different cases, in the case of David, they're an LP, but essentially all of the customers of everyone up on this panel is pharma in different ways, with George on the drug discovery side, with Kim on the clinical trial side, with David as his primary sort of sole LP in the current fund being pharma. But there's a different interpretation in each case, right? But I think up here what you're looking at is truly the future of pharmaceuticals through multiple stages, right? That we have discovery, we have clinical trials, we have real world evidence as applied to clinical trials or post-approval, like I know you're investing in, David. But one of the things that runs through this, or when people say, do we want to use AI to discover drugs in a few hours, like I know George can, versus 10 years and $1 billion? Of course, the answer is yes. And there's been a lot of publicity recently, a number of companies entering into, say, the discovery space with different modes of attack, using genetics, using chemistry, using even real world evidence, so on and so forth. But the thing that ties all of those companies together, the things that tie all of these companies together is that data perspective, right? And so, I'd love for you guys to go down the line, and for, the companies you're most involved with, talk a little bit about the state of this modern industry, say AI and drug discovery, what's currently out there on the market, but what's also holding that back in terms of data and the issues around unstructured data, private data, right, or data that's not clean. So, George, start with you a little bit. If you could frame sort of the state of AI and drug discovery, but also what are the challenges in terms from the data side of truly making this new industry scale?
Yeah, that's a really, really important topic, and it's a sore point in this whole process, unfortunately, because as much as I would love to start playing with the latest, greatest AI algorithms and kind of feed them into the platform and the workflow and make new predictions, I can't do any of that without a properly structured, clean, federated, parsed data set.
Yep.
Right. And in my case, it's exceptionally difficult because I need molecular data in a structured format. So this isn't just text and strings, integers, numbers, etc. It's literally three-dimensional molecules that I somehow have to convert into something that the algorithm can read. The most basic language that computers read are ones and zeros. So I've gone through a tremendous number of steps, not only acquiring that data to begin with, but then converting it into machine-readable bit vectors, which are just strings of ones and zeros. Now, there are approaches to do that, but there is no standardized approach. There's no canonical algorithm or formulation of turning a three-dimensional molecule, and this includes all the dihedrals, the angles, the torsions, the biophysical aspects of it, into literally a long string of hundreds of thousands of bits. But even to get to that, I need a source to pull data from. And in our case, and maybe it's different with clinical trial, and maybe you have some oversight from the regulators, there's virtually no oversight when it comes to biochemical academic data. So the scientists that are producing these data sets are really just publications for new molecules or new series of compounds that they send to the journal. And ironically, they sometimes start out as digital form, like they'll use molecular modeling software, but the publisher wants them in a flat PDF file, right? So they flatten the images, the information, send it off, it gets published, they get their accolades, they get their grants. And people like us need to go back to those PDF files and literally redigitize them so that we can make use of them, right? And aside from those hurdles, it's uncovering errors in the molecules that the chemists themselves who design these molecules fail to check because they don't use the software to look for errors in chirality or in bonds, and sometimes they're physically impossible structures that they're publishing, that they don't have that need other than just getting it out there. So there's a huge challenge in acquiring that and making it useful for the models downstream.
And to give a little insight, to in George's defense, when we were talking about launching Repurpose with George, of course, as investors, we always talk about, what's your moat? And I believe there was a time, George, if I remember correctly, sort of looks in my eye and said, it took me 10 years to build this data, to clean the data and turn it from public, dirty, unstructured data into proprietary, private, structured data that could actually be used to create drugs in silico or to repurpose drugs in silico. I got a clear understanding that this isn't something, even given an enormous budget, that you're going to be able to catch up with in a few weeks or a few months, right? And so, Kim, I know for you from the data side, especially with clinical trials, more clinical trial data, based on federal governments is supposed to be public, but it's not. And I know you have a lot of relationships with Pharma, though, where they're trying to integrate their private data into your publicly available, so to speak, algorithms, right? Your proprietary algorithms. So I'd love for you to speak a little bit of that give and take and how you're working with Pharma to both structure their data, but also to pull it out of the dark recesses as well.
Right. So pharma is interesting in that, yes, because of the regulatory environment, they do have to publish their post-trial information, and that is publicly available. However, it's not inclusive of all of the data that they've accumulated throughout the trial. So you think, I'm getting some really rich information here, and you are to a certain extent, but you get what you pay for, a bit of that. And so we have processed, that publicly available data in many, many, many different forms. And it's really interesting to us because while some of the data is structured, there's quite a bit that's not. So we use a lot of, NLP, NLU techniques, and we've built our own clinical trials ontology so that we can understand of all of these data, what's important for us as we're, developing our algorithms to be able to give insights and recommendations. Awesome, cool, we've got this repository. Well, then we engage with Big Pharma, and they're like, we've got brilliant minds that have been running these trials for years and years and years, but somehow these brilliant minds can't find a lot of these documents that we've stored away, maybe in PDF format, maybe in, paper pen format. And so, there's a very much a structural, kind of aspect that when we're talking with pharmaceutical companies, there's a ton of dark data that they have never, utilized to move forward. So, they're not looking back and going, hey, what could we have done better? They're essentially closing the book and moving forward very quickly. And so it gets to be really interesting from our perspective, because it's like, how can we mine those data and then marry them to our own data assets so that we can provide really, really, granular recommendations and insights so that they can develop their protocols.
Yeah, and by the way, that behavior, if anyone else, parents here, that's how my kids behave as well, right? They make a mistake and just put it over in the corner and walk away and pretend it didn't happen, right? So, David, from your perspective, I know you've got some companies in your portfolio working in clinical trials, and some that have even been brought in that weren't originally meant for that. But I wonder if you could speak to that, but also, some insider knowledge because of your relationship with a strategic pharma company, and maybe some of the things that George and Kim are talking about and how you understand it from your partner's perspective.
Right. No, I actually agree with a lot of things that Kim said, just because, and you have to, in a way, think about motivations within a large pharma. At the point of where the researchers are, they want to, basically, this is their project. So they're, in a way, their career is kind of riding on it. So they don't want to take any risk that will put them in a situation where if it doesn't work out or using a new technology, that they're going to be faulted for it. No one's going to fault them for doing what they used to do, because no one's going to, but if you fail by using a new technology, you may actually get blamed. So you have to kind of think of it from that point of view. But I totally agree about, kind of federated data within an organization. I had the opportunity to actually talk to the head of the real-world evidence group within Astellas, and they are growing in size because they really understand what the value is. Now they changed their name to some kind of analytics group, because what they're doing is not just looking outside to get evidence or data sets that reflect real-world evidence. They're now also looking internally to say that we have all this data that we could mine internally, and as you said, some are just in Excel spreadsheet in someone's laptop versus being in a very usable data format. So now they're trying to, because there's a lot of value there. One caution about that though, there's always concern about unearthing something that they don't want to unearth and needing to expose it. So there's this tension. It's like, okay, how much do we actually explore all the data that we have, or how much value there is, versus things that maybe we just need to move on. And so, there's this tension internally. But I think that, this recognition that data is important is clearly true. I don't know if there is a pharma group that doesn't have their version of data and data analytics, a group that does that, whether it's acquisition of new data sets so that they could get to a point where they could have a control group that they don't have to have as part of a clinical trial, but that's generalized and easily usable using real-world evidence, versus just having a strategy about how to use data overall in their overall development, whether it's clinical trials or even medical affairs. One of the critical things that they actually pay a lot of money for is understanding the customer base. That's why IMS/Qvia it's like they make tons of money because of that very important data set. Going back to now, how some of the digital health companies that I've invested in, how they work with pharma, is that I haven't invested in a company that is strictly, improving clinical trials or clinical trial optimization. But they had underlying technologies that were very valuable that now pharma is using to help them with their clinical trials. For one of our companies called Tissue Analytics, their underlying technology is the ability to capture information about disease of the skin. Started with chronic wounds, but they could capture other information, whether it is burns, acne, anything, and be able to capture that very accurately and easily, and be able to provide longitudinal, data overall, so that even the original intention wasn't to, hit pharma. They are being approached to say, hey, now your underlying technology gives us an ability to really capture information, and ultimately remotely, that they weren't able to do it before. Another company is actually created a mobile platform to do neurocognitive assessments. Again, historically this has been done where you use paper-based surveys where someone had to actually proctor and time and to make sure that it was done appropriately. But now you could use an iPad or an iPhone and actually do the same test but more accurately, and that now the data is available at that time, and then you could do this over a period of time so that you could capture more information more accurately. And they're now being approached by pharma who are doing clinical trials too, because the cognitive information is an important part of their overall clinical trial. So it is interesting that it's a reflection of where pharma is going. Because of this movement, especially at the FDA, that they're more receptive to the idea of real-world evidence. They're trying to capture a lot more information about individuals between clinic visits. Ultimately, there's a lot of things that happen between, a doctor will see an individual. Yes, what is that? And they're able to capture whether through his biometrics or these type of applications.
Well, and I think what's fascinating there, what you're hitting on as we move, if you will, from left to right on the drug development process, with discovery, clinical trials, and where you're investing, of course, real world evidence turns into what our previous panel was talking about around the delivery of care, right? Longitudinal data. And so one of the things very purposely that we wanted to set it up this way, right, is talking about how some people separate pharma from hospital services and physician services, but with software, there is this merging that's occurring, I think, in real time, that pharma is part of an ecosystem of disease management, which includes IoT devices and the delivery of care and clinical decision support and so on and so forth. So the things that Aptar is working on or GE Ventures is investing in overlap with pharma getting new therapies to the patient. So with that, I wanted to turn it over to the audience and see if anyone has any questions or comments for the panel today.
It's a question for George. So I love the concept of repurpose.ai, but one of the things I've noticed is actually a market inefficiency, that although you're dealing with molecules that have been de-risked, most of them are safe, have been in the clinic, so you have a much shorter timeline. They're very likely to have a shorter patent span because you're not going to get composition of matter, you're just going to get method of use. And a lot of investors actually resist that approach. Even though it has been de-risked, they are always looking for the 20 years patent protection. So have you encountered that, and what's your experience in that space?
We encountered it yesterday. Someone brought that up. There are going to be a lot of pushbacks from points like that, and you're absolutely right. It's not as foolproof, perhaps, as getting the composition of matter, because in many cases it's already expired, as you alluded to, and so we are just patenting a new method of use or compositions around this new method in case one of our partners or we decide to derivatize it. But I think that the bigger picture and really the advantage of being software-based is that I'm not married to a particular molecule or a set of molecules. I could literally offload these at a fraction of what most drug discovery companies would, because I haven't invested much time, effort, money. I mean, we're talking about orders of magnitude cheaper. So the cost is much less, and where we're partnering these out, We're going for rare diseases, but also other indications that our partners might be interested in, where they can pick up and take those efforts further and can build, maybe a more comprehensive patent wall or regular, you get other benefits by being first in class or, first in a therapeutic area. So you get market exclusivity in addition to the patent coverage. But yeah, I mean, if the price is right, I think the dynamics changes and the economics changes. To Bill's point, it is very economics driven, especially in the rare disease that angle. But I mean, this I call it a donut machine. I could just keep cranking the wheel, and I mean, we're at maybe a drug a quarter. I'm trying to bring that down to a drug a month, and I literally don't have the capacity to develop these as a pharmaceutical company would. So it's just offloading, selling them, partnering them, and moving on and creating this more and more. And there's a backlog of thousands of drugs that fit this profile of past phase 1 but failed phase 2 or further that this platform would be very amenable for.
Yeah, I think if I may add, because I'm passionate about this question, I think it's a valid question if you're looking backwards, but it's arguably not valid looking forward. Because to George's point and where I started this discussion about the downward pricing pressure on pharma or the pricing justification pressure on pharma, when you're introducing technologies like this, it completely changes the mathematics that are involved in drug discovery. So now drugs where you had to recoup that $2 billion of sunk cost, you only need to recoup tens of millions or maybe $100 million of sunk cost, right? So you've got drugs that are 1/20th of the cost to bring to market, and they can be priced accordingly. And so I'm actually excited on too. Simon, you brought up rare disease. So rare disease, this is fascinating, right? So rare diseases that you could not attack previously are now financially viable because of the reduced sunk costs that are in the market. Also, what's interesting, and this is personal point of view, it changes the dynamic where if you've worked in pharma, the term, this is a Me Too drug, like that's dirty. You never want to be part of a Me Too drug. But now, if you can create Me Too drugs that are proprietary, but are 1/20th or 1/10th the cost of what the current drugs are on the market, and they're as good, if not better, right? What drug is going to be prescribed? Right? The drug that's 1/10th, 1/20th of the price with at least as good results. Or now you can have entire businesses based around truly rare diseases. So it changes the dynamic. So I think this is where we've got a war would be the wrong word, but we've got a significant inflection point that's now occurring in the pharmaceutical sector. I see you shaking your head. So I don't know if you completely agree or completely disagree with what I'm saying. But
I'm right there with you.
All right, there we go.
My experience is that pharma's not there yet.
They're not. But I will say honestly, there are a lot of BD teams here this week where I can say without naming names, they're on the hunt. And the other problem is pharma has a significant pipeline issue, right? And interestingly enough, they have a significant small molecule pipeline issue because they transitioned from small molecule to large molecules, and the small molecule cupboard is bare, and now they're rushing back to find pipeline as well.
And we should add, according to that, their own pipeline might be mined with a platform like mine. So this wouldn't be a new drug, something that the composition of matter is expired or owned by someone else. It could very well be those same pharmas that have huge pipelines, some of which are aging, shelved, or kind of losing interest, that we can bring back life to by finding a new rare disease and finding a new angle with it.
And I'm smiling because just yesterday, George was in a BD meeting and informed a pharma company that he was speaking with that he had a repurposing opportunity within their own portfolio. But we have to get that CDA in place first, that they were obviously completely unaware of. Other questions from the audience? Yes?
Yeah, so a question I had on to George. So one of the issues in the rare disease space, obviously, is that most of these diseases are caused by novel mutations, right? So you're not going to repurpose because most of the morbidity in these kids is really they're new mutations that have never been seen before, number one. So I'm curious, I'm assuming that repurposing doesn't work in that world, number one. Number two, in the context of, I think, the dialogue with Simon, I think one of the issues in this diagnostic odyssey with these kids is that certainly it takes 7.6 years. We've all heard the numbers. But the fundamental thing I think that's lacking in the space and why the kids take 7 years to diagnose is not just that, neonatal medicine is still dependent on phenotypic diagnosis, and cancer has certainly moved beyond that, right? Look at what foundation medicine has converted the whole field to, genomics and molecular diagnostics. But in the case of the kids, by the time a newborn or a pediatric case makes it up to the head of pediatric genetics at a level 4 critical care unit or a major children's hospital, that's the problem. It takes too long, and they're only seeing probably the top 10% of the babies, right? Because phenotypically they're missing them as they're going through being referred up and up to the, the level 4 critical care units. So, my thinking has been one way to solve this problem is to drive some of the most innovative technologies like genome sequencing down out into the primary physician's office. But in order to do that, I don't think we have the digital infrastructure to implement genomics in a primary care pediatrics office in Dubuque, Iowa. And so I think there is an opportunity there. But I think unlike the tech space and life sciences, we really haven't built that digital infrastructure. It just still exists in the top tier 1 academic institutions. So I'm curious if you could comment on those 2 points.
There's a few things there. And just to clarify, so you're right in that many, if not most, rare diseases don't have clinically validated approaches to the therapy, let alone clinical trials that are well vetted by FDA and other groups that have gone that route. But at its core, a rare disease is a mutation that leads to either misfolded or some kind of problematic protein, right? And with small molecules, which is my area of focus, I'm targeting protein. So I can predict a new target. If that target is known to be involved in a rare disease, and we have information about associations between these rare diseases and the proteins that cause them, then I can make that prediction. And then the conversation turns over to the FDA. Are you willing to take a bigger risk on this particular drug? And are there physicians that know how to test and recruit and properly enroll patients that would be most responsive for that disease? So yes, despite we don't have an ideally, I totally echo your sentiment of doing gene analysis. I think that should be done across the board, and I'm starting to implement gene expression profiles as a way to make the predictive platform more robust. But it's really just finding that target and then seeing if there's an association to a rare disease. And I think there is something that can be learned from that approach and still begin to maybe start those trials, even if it's something that's blue sky that hasn't been done before.
Well, and I think on that point, I mean, Kim, love to bring you in here. When you're thinking about intelligent protocol design, right, or specifically rare diseases, what I find fascinating is really there's been a lot of rare disease trials where in the past they had detected signal, but it hadn't been common, if you will, forms of efficacy based on the numbers, and so maybe drugs weren't approved in the past. But there's been a number, whatever you think about the politics of the current administration, from an FDA point of view, it's been fairly sophisticated with an idea of if we see signal, let's get it out on the market, and the market can decide how much it's worth, and the market can decide some of the details. But as long as it's safe and somebody's responding, and I wonder from your perspective, I think clinical trials are really important here for sort of maximizing signal and figuring out how to construct clinical trials on very small populations that also bring these drugs not just from concept to you, but from phase 1 through phase 3 and approval. So I don't know if you got an opinion on how your type of technology can help bring these things through clinical trials faster with these tiny populations?
Sure. It's interesting. We're having a lot of conversations around rare disease, and a lot of folks that are in the space are asking those questions, right? And so we don't have a ton of historical data around rare disease, or they wouldn't be rare disease, right? And so it's interesting to us to think about it in terms of what can we are therapeutic area agnostic in terms of the data that we have consumed. And so we're looking at, other areas that have been, where they've run trials and being able to use parallel studies and things like that. Also looking at different trial designs to get these treatments to market faster, and taking into to account the regulatory landscape and how quickly can we get these drugs approved. So I think from our perspective, it's a multifactorial approach, right? There's just no one thing that I can say, oh yeah, well, if we're talking about rare disease, we can get there faster. Here, we're looking at the regulatory landscape. We're looking at, what other trials have been run. We're looking at what key opinion leaders are saying to be able to construct that
But I think what's
protocol.
important here is that due to your approach to study design, where essentially these studies, these rare disease studies, would essentially, if you will, be de novo studies based on hunches, you're now able to bring, not the same disease, but maybe comparable disease populations, and pull out best practices that was previously not available to the market. It was a market doing this on hunches and KOLs that have treated these patients, but not a sober, detached, and robust process to design these clinical trials. And I think that's very interesting that you're now able to bring that to this process and solve some of these issues that Simon and some of our other guests were speaking about.
Yeah, I agree. I think that, being able to look across even therapeutic areas to see if there are insights that can be provided to a rare disease context is really valuable. And a lot of the folks are saying, we understand, that there's not a ton of data, but what have you traversed that you can provide to us or serve up to us that we can then make critical decisions on? And I think that's something that technology can do so much better than, a human mind that would, go ahead. I'll jump in.
No, you can finish. You'll have the last one.
More than a human mind that would actually have to traverse it, themselves. There's just kind of this idea that when humans are reviewing data and information, there's a certain amount of fatigue that we have. And what we're finding is that, the technology can surface things that people have just gone, oh, wow, I didn't look at it that way, or I didn't see it, those data, or I didn't have access to those data. And we're able to surface that.
Another question? And this will be the last one, and then we'll break for some networking.
Sorry, hopefully this will be an interesting one.
Of course.
So for full transparency, I'm from one of the big pharma, so we'll just do that one. So what I find quite interesting is, as I see, so George, obviously we were talking about how basically new molecular discovery is becoming just a search problem, and we basically utilizing technology to do that. It's interesting where trials are going, Kim, so whereby at what point do we stop just augmenting a current process and reinvent the process from the ground up to a point where when have we got a critical mass of data to replicate the digital twin of a human being's pathways where we don't need the human for the clinical trial? It is done on a digital twin basis. I'd love to know. Actually, in fairness, it is a full spectrum from discovery to development to how, and also how those two interact to be able to do that. So I'd love to.
And what you're talking about is, rather than incremental improvements on what we've been doing, tear it all down, and if we could rebuild it today, what would we do, right? Yeah, I think that's a fascinating question, and a very good question to end on, by the way. Thank you.
And I think from our perspective, one of the things I'm thinking about, a couple of different big pharma companies that we've been working with and talking with, there are some that are very risk averse, and they're just like, this is the way we've always done it. I'm looking at, incremental, I'm looking at digitizing the process, right? And so that's why we're stuck with Microsoft Word. A lot of these folks are just like, I know my template, and I'm going to use my template. And yet, on the other side of the spectrum, we've got a couple of folks that are saying, we don't even want to tell you how we've been doing it internally. Like, we understand the landscape, but we don't want to tell you. We want you to tell us how you would approach this entire process without biasing you. And that's really exciting to us, but it's certainly, from my perspective, trying to build a a product and not having to rebuild it every time we engage with a big pharma company is that tension. How far can we go that would allow, a wide girth of folks to adopt and yet continue to push the envelope? So it's a question that I'd like to see answered as well. We're trying to push as hard as we can, and I love, our team from a perspective is looking at this not in terms of how is everybody doing this. In fact, our head of product is always laughing and saying, I don't necessarily want to hear how they're doing it because I want to really be thinking about this in terms of how can we do this? How can we use the most, revolutionary approach or technology and apply it in a way that hasn't been done before?
And from a small molecule perspective, I love the idea of systemizing this, and I try to do this with every aspect of what I'm building. Repurposing in particular is something that people think of just as a serendipitous discovery, right? Alopecia or Viagra are famous examples. But if we can do this systematically, if we can predict with high accuracy, and this is changing the mindset of what people think of in terms of small molecules. These, although many of which have been designed specifically to target a particular protein for a particular disease, small molecules, because they're so small, they tend to bind multiple things. So this concept of one bullet, one target is now proven to be untrue, right? The polypharmacourt, the whole aspect of multiple targets for one molecule. When we think of these off-target effects, we think of side effects negatively, but some side effects are positive, right? And that's where you have physicians prescribing off-label, and that's what makes the whole concept of repurposing possible. But if we can systemize and do this rationally and on a gigantic scale, then we can start to pick those repurposing targets and drugs that are best matched and can be pushed forward from a business and regulatory perspective and create those disease therapeutics quicker.
And David, I'll let you have the last word here. As an investor, as a physician in this space, right? As an investor here, you're hearing from a strategic pharmaceutical company, right? Talking about tearing this down. So, how does this affect your investing and what you're looking for next, right? That's on the horizon, or does it?
Well, let me first answer. I mean, that at least have an opinion about that.
Yeah, sure.
Radical change in a big pharma ain't gonna happen quickly. It's just not. So what they will do is that they will see, well, first of all, they usually want somebody else to do it, then they'll follow along. That's most of the big pharma. No. But what they will do is they would acquire a company that has demonstrated that particular radical change and let somebody else do the experiment and see that positive results. And they typically can take the next step of acquiring that. That's been their model, right? Is they want somebody else to do it. I mean, some of the financing model is that they want to try to get the risk off their balance sheet, somebody else to take the risk, but they're willing to pay up to just get that positive outcome and then bring it inside. So if that radical transformation is to be ultimately adopted, it's going to be done by a small company or smaller company that has actually demonstrated that, and then it will be acquired by big pharma. But it's not going to organically happen in big pharma, at least my opinion.
Most likely funded by Sway Ventures, NextCube, and DGTX, though, right?
However, again, this is a long process. I mean, the thing is that they actually want a lot of validation before they will actually put dollars to it, so that you can't expect that someone, even an internal champion, is not going to be able to do it, because ultimately this is going to take the buy-in of the senior executives and ultimately the board. And they're really, really conservative, so that you don't have expectation that you have one good positive endpoint and then you're going to get acquired. I don't think that's going to happen. You really do need to demonstrate it, that this is for real and that this process is the right way to go before you're going to get the attention of the big pharma.
Thank
Sorry
you.
for the wet blanket here.
No, Debbie Downer. So with that, well, I want to thank everyone for joining us today. I think there might be a little food left. You guys are welcome to hang out for a few minutes. Part of the reason we wanted to get this group together is so people can not network not just with us, but with the folks in the room. But before I let you guys go, I'd love to have the rest of the members from the Sway and NextCube team who are here in the audience come on up. up. A lot of people behind the scenes have done a lot of work. I know. No, to make this happen, and the folks here are the folks that are powering, our success as digital healthcare investors, helping lead us to the next level. Come on, Julie. Julie's always shy, yeah. Well, are you guys taking picture? Well, all right. Well, I got to give Dan a shout out. You guys heard Patrick and Lonnie. They, the events team here, everything you see here, the food, the room setup, all the production here, Patrick and Lonnie were leading that. Also, a special thank you to Bill, who's really led us and led the firms at Next Human Sway into full steam ahead into becoming leaders in the digital health investing space. And it's with his support then I've been able to build something here with both of these firms. And so, like I said, really excited to have all of you guys here in the room. Looking forward to building deeper and deeper relationships with you. And if you'd like to learn more about what we're doing or be a part, of what we're doing at Sway and NextCube, I encourage you to talk to myself or other members of the team here. So with that, thank you guys for coming.